11 caregivers had walked out of the Ashcroft estate in less than 4 months, and the 12th application sat untouched on the kitchen counter until a man named Orion Hale knocked on the door at 11:50 at night. Rain fell steadily over the hills above Seattle. The kind of cold autumn rain that soaked through wool coats and made porch lights flicker behind curtains of mist. The housekeeper, Vera Quinn, opened the door, expecting no one, since the agency had already told her that no one wanted the job anymore. Word had spread through every home health company in the city. Nobody could handle the woman upstairs. Nobody could survive her silence, her fury, or the particular exhaustion of caring for someone who had given up on being cared for at all. Orion stood on the doorstep with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a folder of paperwork so thin it looked almost apologetic. He did not smile. He did not explain himself. He simply asked if the position was still open. And when Vera hesitated, he added that he understood if it was too late to start tonight. Something about the way he said it, calm and unhurried, made her step aside and let him in anyway. She led him through a hallway lined with photographs of a woman none of the staff recognized anymore. Not really, because photographs freeze people at their strongest moment, and the woman upstairs bore no resemblance to any of them. Vera studied him as they walked, trying to place what made him different from the 11 who had come before. He was not young. His hands were rough in the way that came from years of physical work rather than a gym membership. He carried himself the way soldiers sometimes did long after they had left the service, upright but unhurried. As though he had learned somewhere along the way that panic rarely solved anything a steady hand could not. She asked him, almost without meaning to, why he wanted a job that had already broken 11 other people. He told her that he did not think anyone had actually tried to understand what Celeste needed. They had only tried to manage her. And there was a difference between the two that most people never learned. The agency file on him, thin as it was, listed nothing unusual. A long stretch of military medical service, a period running a small private rehabilitation clinic outside Tacoma, closed several years earlier for reasons the file did not specify. No disciplinary complaints, no notable achievements, nothing that would explain why a man with his background would take an overnight position paying far less than his experience could command elsewhere. Vera had learned, over years of managing the household, that the people who mattered most rarely announced themselves loudly, and something about the quiet economy of Orion's answers told her this was one of those times. Celeste Ashcroft had once been the kind of executive that business magazines built entire issues around. She had taken a mid-sized logistics company and turned it into a name recognized on 3 continents. She had walked into boardrooms and left grown men reconsidering their own competence. Then a helicopter carrying her from a conference outside Tacoma had gone down in a stretch of forest 20 miles from any road. And when the rescue teams pulled her from the wreckage 6 hours later, the woman who emerged was no longer able to move anything below her collarbone. The doctors called it a spinal injury, with an uncertain prognosis. Celeste called it the end of everything she had built her identity around. And in the months since, she had made sure that everyone around her understood exactly how she felt about it. Vera walked Orion up the wide staircase, past a window that looked out over the lights of the city far below, and stopped outside a door at the end of the hall. She lowered her voice and told him what she told every new hire, though by now the warning felt more like a formality than useful information. The last caregiver had lasted 3 hours. The one before that had lasted a single overnight shift before quitting by text message at 4 in the morning. Celeste did not want help. She wanted to be left alone in the dark, and anyone who tried to change that arrangement usually regretted it. Orion listened without reaction, then asked a question that stopped Vera halfway through turning the doorknob. He wanted to know whether Celeste still wanted to live like a chief executive, or whether she had decided to live like a patient instead. Vera did not have an answer, because no one had thought to frame the question that way before. She opened the door and stepped back, letting him walk in alone. The room was dim, lit only by the blue glow of a monitor tracking vitals. Nobody was watching closely enough. Celeste lay in a hospital bed that had been fitted into the corner of what used to be a study. Her dark hair spread across the pillow. Her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She heard the door and did not turn her head. "Get out," she said, her voice flat and utterly without warmth. "I did not ring for anyone." Orion set his bag down near the door and did not move closer. He introduced himself simply, gave his name and nothing else. No resume recitation. No reassurances about his qualifications. Celeste turned her eyes toward him then, taking in the plain jacket, the tired posture of a man who had clearly worked long hours for most of his life, the absence of the practiced sympathy she had come to despise in every face that walked through that door. "You will not last until sunrise," she told him. "None of them do. If I leave," he said, "it will be because you stopped fighting. Not because you scared me." For the first time in weeks, Celeste had nothing to say. The silence stretched long enough that the monitor's soft beeping became the only sound in the room. And in that silence, Orion moved toward the bed. Not to touch her, but to study the machinery surrounding it. He crouched by the base of the hospital bed and ran his fingers along a bracket that had been installed at the wrong angle. His expression did not change, but something in the way he tilted his head told anyone paying attention that he had already found something wrong, something that every doctor and nurse and specialist who had passed through that room in 4 months had somehow missed. He did not tell Celeste what he saw. He simply reached for a small notepad in his jacket pocket and began writing, and outside the door, Vera Quinn stood frozen, wondering exactly what kind of caregiver had just walked into her employer's house at midnight. Over the following hour, Orion moved through the room like a man conducting an inspection, rather than beginning a shift. He checked the incline of the mattress and found it set 2 degrees off what any spinal rehabilitation protocol would recommend. He checked the medication schedule taped to the wall and noticed that the pain management dosage had been increased twice in the last month, without any corresponding decrease in physical therapy, a combination that would slowly weaken muscle tone rather than preserve it. He checked the room's lighting and noted that the overhead fixture buzzed faintly, a frequency most people stopped consciously hearing after a while, but which disrupted deep sleep all the same. Celeste watched him work without asking what he was doing, though her eyes followed him with a kind of guarded curiosity she had not felt toward a stranger in a long time. At one point she asked, with more sarcasm than genuine interest, whether he intended to fix her the same way he was fixing her furniture. He answered, without looking up from the bed frame, that furniture healed faster than people, but the principle was the same. Nothing recovered properly if it was set up wrong from the start. He worked methodically, checking the pressure points along her mattress, where prolonged stillness could damage skin and circulation, testing the responsiveness of the call button that had apparently gone unanswered on more than one occasion under previous staff, and noting, with a slight frown, that the room's humidity level was low enough to aggravate the kind of respiratory strain common in patients who spent most of their day lying flat. None of it was dramatic. None of it required a medical degree. It simply required someone willing to notice. When Dr. Elias Rowan, her longtime neurologist, arrived the following morning and found several of his instructions had been quietly adjusted, he was not pleased. He found Orion in the kitchen drinking black coffee and demanded to know who had given him authority to alter a treatment plan he had spent months designing. Orion did not raise his voice. He explained, briefly and without condescension, that he had not changed any medication or any clinical order. He had only changed the things within his control as a caregiver. The bed angle, the lighting, the noise level, the position of pillows, supporting Celeste's shoulders through the night. Dr. Rowan wanted to argue further, but something about the quiet certainty in Orion's answer made him pause instead, and he left the kitchen with more questions than he had walked in with. That first night, Celeste slept nearly 6 hours without waking, the longest unbroken rest she had managed since the accident. When she opened her eyes the next morning, sunlight filtering weakly through the curtains Orion had left slightly parted, she noticed something unfamiliar in her own body, a heaviness in her limbs that felt less like paralysis and more like the ordinary fatigue of a person who had actually slept. She did not mention it to anyone. She was not ready to admit that anything had changed. By the 3rd day, Celeste had decided that the best way to drive Orion out, the way she had driven out 11 caregivers before him, was to make herself as unbearable as possible. She knocked a cup of water from her bedside table with a sharp movement of her elbow, soaking a stack of paperwork Graham Wexler had left for her signature. She snapped at Orion when he adjusted her pillows, told him his hands were too rough, then told him the opposite an hour later. She ordered him out of the room 4 separate times in a single afternoon, and each time he simply stepped into the hallway, waited a few minutes, and returned without a word of protest. Vera Quinn watched this pattern from a distance and expected to find him gone by dinner. Instead, she found him in the kitchen preparing a meal exactly the way the nutritionist had specified months earlier. A specification that had been ignored by nearly every previous caregiver in favor of whatever was fastest. On the 4th night, Celeste tried a different tactic. She told Orion that she did not need him, that his presence in her home was an insult to the life she used to have, that a man who had probably spent his career changing bedpans in some understaffed clinic had no business pretending he understood anything about her. Orion set down the water glass he had been refilling and looked at her directly for the first time that evening. "I am not here to be liked," he said. "I am here to help you take your life back. If that offends you, I understand. But I am not leaving because you are unkind to me." Celeste opened her mouth to respond and found that nothing came out. For the first time since the accident, someone in that house had refused to either flatter her or flee from her, and the absence of both reactions left her strangely unmoored. She turned her face toward the window and said nothing more that night. And Orion adjusted her blankets in silence before dimming the lights and taking his seat in the chair near the door, where he would remain until morning, as he had every night since he arrived. Over the days that followed, Celeste kept testing him in smaller, quieter ways, as though she needed repeated proof before she would allow herself to believe it. She asked him sharp questions designed to embarrass him, about his failed clinic, about whether he had ever actually helped anyone recover, or simply told himself comforting stories about his own usefulness. Orion answered each question honestly, without defensiveness, admitting that his clinic had closed because he had spent more on patients who could not pay than the business could sustain, a fact he stated plainly, without asking for sympathy. Celeste had expected him to flinch under her questions. Instead, he answered them the way a man answers questions about the weather. And slowly, without either of them acknowledging it directly, the sharpness in her voice began to soften into something closer to genuine curiosity. 2 floors below, in an office that had once belonged to Celeste and now functioned as the temporary command center for the entire Ashcroft Dynamics operation, Naomi Pierce sat reviewing quarterly figures with an unease she had not felt in months. Naomi had stepped into the role of acting chief executive the week after the accident, a role she had performed with quiet competence and increasing comfort. She had grown used to the corner office, the deference of the board, the particular weight of authority that came with being the only person capable of making decisions for a company as large as Ashcroft Dynamics. She had also grown used to the assumption, unspoken but widely shared among the executive team, that Celeste would likely never fully recover, and that the company's future rested with whoever occupied the chief executive's chair in the meantime. Word had reached Naomi that morning that the new caregiver, a man with an unremarkable resume and almost no online footprint, had already made changes to Celeste's care regimen within his first day, and that Celeste had slept longer than she had in months. It was, on its surface, good news. Naomi did not receive it that way. She sat with the report for a long moment, then picked up her phone and made a call to someone outside the house, asking them, in careful and deliberately vague language, to keep an eye on the new hire and report back anything unusual. She told herself it was simple due diligence, the kind of caution any responsible executive would exercise when a stranger gained access to the most vulnerable member of the family. She did not examine too closely why the thought of Celeste's recovery made her stomach tighten instead of loosen. Naomi had not always been the kind of person who calculated advantage out of tragedy. She had joined the company years earlier as an operations analyst, promoted steadily through genuine competence, admired by colleagues for her precision and her willingness to work longer hours than anyone else in her department. Somewhere in the months since the accident, though, Comfort had crept in where caution used to live, and she had begun quietly mistaking the temporary authority she now held for something she had actually earned. She told herself the company ran more smoothly under her hand than it ever had under Celeste's more mercurial leadership, and there were days she almost believed it. But belief, she was slowly learning, was a fragile thing to build an entire identity upon, especially when the person whose chair she occupied was still, technically, breathing in a room 2 floors above her office. By the end of the first week, Orion had reorganized nearly every aspect of Celeste's daily routine. He replaced the passive stretching sessions that Dr. Rowan's team had been running with a more deliberate program built around neurological stimulation, small repeated signals meant to coax dormant pathways back into activity. He introduced breathing exercises that Celeste found humiliating at first, childish even, until she noticed that her chest no longer felt as tight by the end of each session. He spent long stretches simply talking with her, not about her company or her injury, but about ordinary things: the weather, a book left open on her nightstand, the particular way rain sounded against old windows, conversations that asked nothing of her, and therefore, over time, made her willing to give a little more. On the 6th day, while adjusting the position of her right hand against a folded towel, Orion noticed her index finger twitch. He said nothing at first, wanting to be certain it was not simply muscle spasm, the kind of involuntary movement that sometimes occurred in paralyzed limbs and meant nothing at all. He watched closely for the rest of the session, and when he asked her, gently, to try to move the finger on purpose, Celeste stared at her own hand with an expression somewhere between disbelief and fear, as though she did not trust herself to hope. She tried. The finger twitched again, faint but unmistakable. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Celeste turned her face away, and Orion realized she was crying, silently. The first tears anyone in that house had seen her shed since the accident. Dr. Rowan, informed of the movement the next morning, examined her hand for nearly 20 minutes before admitting, with visible reluctance, that he could not fully explain the improvement given her scan results from 2 months earlier. He asked Orion detailed questions about his methods, questions Orion answered patiently, though he made clear that he claimed no miracle, only the slow accumulation of consistency, rest, and stimulation that her previous care had lacked. Naomi, informed of the same development through the household staff, did not share the room's cautious hope. She sat alone in Celeste's old office that evening, long after the rest of the staff had gone home, staring at the city lights through the window, calculating what a full recovery would mean for every decision she had made in the past 4 months, every deal she had signed in Celeste's absence, every relationship she had quietly cultivated with board members who had grown comfortable answering to her instead. That same night, a member of the household staff, who worked the overnight cleaning shift, noticed a light on in the records room down the hall from the main office, a room that held years of physical files predating the company's move to digital storage. She did not think much of it until she mentioned it in passing to Vera the next morning. And Vera, remembering something Orion had said about paying attention to small details, decided to check the security footage herself. What she found unsettled her enough that she brought it directly to Orion rather than to anyone else in the house. The footage showed a figure entering the records room a few minutes after midnight, moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, and leaving less than 10 minutes later carrying a folder that had not been visible when they entered. Orion asked to see the footage himself, and watched it twice before saying anything. He told Vera to keep this between the two of them for now, and though she wanted to press him for an explanation, something in his expression convinced her to trust his judgment. Whatever he had noticed, he was not yet ready to say it out loud. The second week brought a different kind of tension into the house. Celeste, buoyed by the small victory of her finger's movement, began pushing herself harder during their sessions, sometimes past the point Orion advised, frustrated by how slowly her body responded compared to how quickly she wanted it to. There were mornings she refused to try at all, convinced the previous day's progress had been an illusion, and mornings she pushed so hard she exhausted herself before noon. Orion adjusted around her moods without complaint, neither indulging her worst days nor pretending her best days meant the fight was over. There were mornings when Celeste woke convinced that the previous day's progress had been a trick of exhaustion, a temporary illusion her body would take back the moment she tried to prove it again. On those mornings, she refused to leave the bed at all, turning her face to the wall and telling Orion, in a voice stripped of its usual sharpness, that she was tired of hoping for things that would eventually disappoint her anyway. He did not argue with her on those days. He simply sat with her, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking quietly about nothing important, until the worst of the fear passed, and she was willing to try again, even if only for a few minutes. On her better days, the opposite problem emerged. She pushed herself past every limit Orion suggested, gritting her teeth through exercises meant to last 5 minutes until they stretched to 15, driven by something that looked less like determination and more like anger at her own body for taking so long to obey her. He learned to recognize the difference between healthy effort and self-punishment, and more than once he had to physically stop her, taking her hand gently and telling her that exhausting herself into collapse would only cost her the following 2 days of progress. She resented him for it in the moment, every time, and thanked him for it quietly, always later, always once the frustration had cooled into something closer to gratitude. It was during one of these steadier stretches, while helping her review a stack of medical records Dr. Rowan had left behind, that Orion noticed something in the file connected to the helicopter accident itself, a discrepancy in the maintenance log dates that did not match the timeline described in the official incident report. He said nothing to Celeste at first, not wanting to raise a question he could not yet answer, but he began quietly reviewing every document related to the crash that he could find in the house, working late into the night after Celeste had finally fallen asleep. What he found troubled him. The helicopter's maintenance had been scheduled for review the week before the flight that crashed, a routine inspection that appeared, according to the paperwork, to have been completed and passed. Yet a separate document, an internal memo buried among files that seemed to have been filed incorrectly, rather than deliberately hidden, suggested the inspection had actually been postponed at the request of someone in the executive office, citing scheduling conflicts that Orion could not verify against any calendar he had access to. He brought the discrepancy to Graham Wexler, the company's longtime attorney, a cautious man who had represented Celeste's family for over a decade, and who reacted to Orion's questions with visible discomfort rather than surprise. After a long silence, Graham admitted something he had not shared with anyone outside the family. In the weeks before the accident, Celeste had been preparing to restructure the entire executive team, a move that would have affected several senior leaders, Naomi among them, whose positions and compensation depended heavily on maintaining the current structure. Graham insisted he had no evidence connecting that restructuring plan to the crash itself, and he seemed genuinely uncertain whether he believed there was a connection at all. But the timing, he admitted, had never sat entirely comfortably with him, even if he had never allowed himself to say so aloud. Orion thanked him and said nothing further that night. But the following morning, he began looking more closely at the household's communication records, the kind of routine administrative logs that most people never thought to review. Phone systems, visitor logs, the digital calendar that tracked who had access to which parts of the estate and when. Buried in an old backup of the estate's internal phone system, a system installed years earlier and largely forgotten since the shift to cell phones, Orion found a recording he almost missed, an automated backup file from a landline call placed the morning of the crash, before Celeste had left for the airfield. He listened to it alone in the small office off the kitchen, the rain outside tapping steadily against the window. The recording was brief, most of it routine scheduling conversation, but near the end, a voice Orion did not immediately recognize mentioned rerouting the flight through a different airfield due to a maintenance delay, a delay that contradicted the paperwork, claiming the helicopter had already passed inspection days earlier. The voice on the recording did not belong to Celeste. It belonged, Orion was fairly certain after listening twice more, to someone whose voice he had heard often enough in the halls of the estate over the past 2 weeks. He did not confront anyone yet. He saved the recording carefully and continued his work with Celeste as though nothing had changed, though something in his manner over the following days grew quietly more watchful. That same week, During a session focused on shoulder mobility, Celeste managed to lift her right arm nearly 2 inches off the mattress before her strength gave out. It was a small movement by any ordinary measure, but in that room it felt enormous. She laughed, an unfamiliar sound in that house, sharp with disbelief. And for a moment, the woman who had once commanded boardrooms full of powerful men reappeared. If only briefly, in the tilt of her chin and the spark behind her eyes. She asked Orion, half joking and half serious, whether he thought she would ever walk again. He did not offer false certainty. He told her the honest truth, that no one could promise that outcome, but that every session, every small movement, every night of real sleep was building toward possibility rather than away from it. She seemed to accept that answer more easily than she would have accepted a comforting lie. And something in the space between them shifted further that day, no longer the careful distance of patient and caregiver, but something closer to two people who had each lost someone and were slowly, cautiously, learning to trust again. Later that same evening, while sitting near her bed after the household had gone quiet, Celeste asked Orion about his own life, something none of the previous 11 caregivers had thought to do, or perhaps had been too afraid to ask. He told her, in a few plain sentences, that his wife had died several years earlier, that he had spent time in military medical service before that he had once run a small rehabilitation center of his own before selling it and stepping back from that world entirely. She asked why he had come back to it now, back to a house full of tension and a patient who had done everything possible to drive him away. He told her that everyone deserved a chance to fight for themselves before anyone decided the fight was over. She did not respond right away, but when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the sharpness it usually held. "Nobody has said something like that to me since the accident," she admitted quietly. The following week, tensions in the boardroom reached a point Orion could no longer ignore from a distance. Naomi, growing increasingly anxious as reports of Celeste's improvement spread among the senior staff, pushed the board toward an emergency vote on formally declaring Celeste incapacitated for the purposes of long-term corporate governance, a legal designation that would cement Naomi's authority indefinitely regardless of how much physical progress Celeste continued to make. The vote was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and word of it reached the estate only 2 days in advance, delivered by Graham Wexler, with visible reluctance and an apology he did not quite manage to finish. Celeste received the news with a stillness that worried Orion more than anger would have. She said very little that evening, staring out the window at the rain, and he did not press her to talk, understanding that some decisions needed to be made in silence before they could be spoken aloud. On the morning of the vote, the boardroom filled with executives who had spent months operating under the assumption that Celeste Ashcroft would never again sit among them in any meaningful capacity. Naomi stood at the head of the table, her presentation prepared, her arguments rehearsed, when the door opened and Celeste entered the room, moving unsteadily with the support of a walking frame, her legs trembling with the effort of each step, but moving under her own power for the first time in 4 months. The room went silent. Papers stopped shuffling. Someone's coffee cup paused halfway to their mouth and simply stayed there. Orion stood a few steps behind her, close enough to help if her strength failed, far enough to make clear that this walk belonged entirely to her. He did not speak. He did not need to. Celeste made her way to the head of the table, lowered herself into a chair with visible effort, and looked directly at Naomi with an expression that carried none of the fragility the room had expected. "I understand there is a vote scheduled this morning," she said, her voice steadier than her legs. "I would like to hear the case for it directly, since it concerns my own capacity to run the company I built." Naomi's carefully prepared arguments faltered under the weight of Celeste's presence, in a way they never would have against an empty chair and a doctor's report. The vote, originally expected to pass without meaningful resistance, was postponed indefinitely by a board suddenly uncertain of the ground beneath their earlier assumptions. Before the meeting ended, Celeste made one further request, delivered calmly but with unmistakable authority. She asked the board to authorize an independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding the helicopter crash, citing new information that had come to her attention regarding the maintenance records. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi's expression, for the briefest moment, betrayed something closer to fear than surprise. The investigation began within days. Led by an outside firm, with no ties to Ashcroft Dynamics leadership, it moved quickly once it started. Following the same threads, Orion had already traced through old phone records and misfiled memos. Within 2 weeks, investigators confirmed what Orion had suspected since that quiet night, listening to an old backup recording. The maintenance delay on the helicopter had been requested deliberately, and communications recovered from a maintenance contractor's own records showed a pattern of coordination with someone inside the company who had pushed repeatedly for the postponement, citing budget concerns that did not match the company's actual financial records at the time. The investigation stopped short of proving that anyone had intended for the crash to happen. What it proved instead was a pattern of decisions made for reasons of personal advancement rather than malice that had created the conditions for disaster without anyone fully reckoning with the risk they were taking. Naomi Pierce had pressured the contractor to delay the inspection in order to keep Celeste's travel schedule on track for a set of negotiations that would have strengthened Naomi's own standing within the company, unaware or unwilling to consider that the helicopter's readiness might matter more than the calendar. Naomi was suspended from her position within a day of the findings becoming public within the company, and resigned formally less than a week later. Before the board could vote on her removal, she did not contest the decision publicly, and much of the company's senior staff seemed almost relieved to see the matter resolved quietly, rather than dragged through a lengthy public dispute. Graham Wexler, who had spent years balancing loyalty to the Ashcroft family with the practical demands of corporate law, found himself unexpectedly at the center of the transition. He met with Celeste privately after the findings were made public, apologizing for not pressing harder on his own early doubts about the timing of the crash. Celeste did not blame him. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in that boardroom, how easily comfortable assumptions could calcify into willful blindness, and how rare it was for anyone inside a system of power to question the story that system told about itself. Dr. Rowan, for his part, spent long hours revising his understanding of what recovery actually required, and admitted privately to Vera one evening that he had grown so accustomed to treating paralysis as a fixed diagnosis that he had nearly missed the obvious truth sitting in front of him for months: that a body denied rest, dignity, and consistent attention would struggle to heal no matter how sophisticated the surrounding medical technology became. He began, in the weeks that followed, incorporating some of Orion's methods into his broader practice, crediting the change publicly at a regional medical conference the following spring, though he was careful never to overstate what any single approach could promise a patient in circumstances different from Celeste's own. With the investigation concluded, and a new interim leadership structure taking shape under Graham Wexler's careful guidance, life in the estate began to shift into something quieter and more settled. Celeste's recovery continued steadily, each week bringing small but undeniable progress. She could sit unsupported for longer stretches. She could feed herself again, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease. She could stand at the walking frame for nearly a full minute before her legs began to shake. Orion, watching all of this unfold with the same quiet attentiveness he had brought to every part of his work in that house, began to sense that his role there was nearing its natural end, not because Celeste no longer needed help, but because the kind of help she needed was changing into something she could increasingly provide for herself. One evening, as autumn rain continued to fall steadily outside, Celeste asked him directly whether he planned to leave once she no longer required overnight care. He did not answer immediately, choosing his words carefully. "I go where I am needed," he said, "and I stay only as long as staying helps." "Are you going to disappear the way you always do?" she asked, her tone somewhere between challenge and genuine uncertainty. He only smiled, a small, private expression that gave nothing away, and told her that some answers were better shown than spoken. A few days later, Orion informed Vera quietly that he would be concluding his work at the estate by the end of the month, timing his departure around a schedule of transition sessions meant to prepare Celeste and her new physical therapy team for the next phase of her recovery. He said his goodbyes to the household staff simply, without ceremony, the same way he had arrived. On his final night, After helping Celeste through her evening routine for the last time, he placed a plain envelope on the small table beside her bed and told her not to open it until morning. Celeste turned the envelope over in her hands the next day, curiosity outweighing her usual caution. Inside, she found a signed document declining the substantial financial bonus her legal team had drawn up weeks earlier as compensation for his role in her recovery, a sum that would have set him up comfortably for years. Beneath the document was a short, handwritten note. "A good caregiver does not create dependence," it read. "They help a person no longer need them at all." She read the note 3 times before setting it down, her eyes stinging in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. She thought about calling him, about asking him to come back, if only to argue with him about the money he had so easily walked away from. She did not make the call. She understood, in the quiet of that morning, that some gestures were not meant to be negotiated, only received. Vera found her still holding the note an hour later and asked, gently, whether she was all right. Celeste told her that for the first time since the accident, she finally understood what her father used to mean when he said that the truest kind of strength was the kind that expected nothing in return. Her father had built the earliest version of the company from almost nothing, and Celeste had spent years since his death chasing a version of strength that looked impressive from the outside, all authority and control, without ever fully understanding the quieter version he had actually meant. Orion, without ever mentioning her father once, had somehow taught her the difference. In the weeks that followed, Celeste's progress accelerated in ways that surprised even Dr. Rowan, who had grown far more cautious in his predictions since the early days of her recovery. She managed a handful of unaided steps by the end of the following month, then a full lap around her bedroom, then, eventually, a slow but steady walk down the length of the main hallway, her hand trailing lightly along the wall for balance rather than support. At her first public appearance since the accident, a press conference held in the company's main auditorium, Celeste chose not to focus on the details of her physical recovery, though the change in her posture and presence spoke for itself to anyone in the room who remembered her before the crash. Instead, she announced the creation of a new philanthropic initiative, funded personally rather than through the company, dedicated to training caregivers and expanding access to rehabilitation therapy for patients who had lost mobility, particularly those without the resources to access the kind of dedicated, attentive care that had changed the course of her own recovery. She named the initiative after the hour her recovery had truly begun, calling it the Midnight Hope Initiative, and spoke briefly about the importance of dignity and care, of being treated as a person capable of fighting for herself rather than a problem to be managed. Near the end of the press conference, as reporters began raising their hands for questions, Celeste noticed a familiar figure standing quietly near the back of the auditorium, dressed simply, clearly intending to leave unnoticed once the event concluded. She paused mid-sentence, then asked him, in front of the entire room, to come forward. Orion hesitated only briefly before making his way to the stage, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden attention but unwilling to refuse her request. Celeste turned to face the gathered press and the rows of employees who had come to watch, her voice steady and clear. 11 people tried to care for my body, she said. Only one helped me find the will to stand back up. The room rose to its feet in applause, the sound rolling through the auditorium in a wave that seemed to catch Orion entirely off guard. He lowered his head slightly, a small, genuine smile crossing his face, the closest thing to public acknowledgement he had allowed himself since walking through that door on a rainy night months earlier. Outside, the rain that had followed the entire length of the story had finally begun to ease. The clouds over Seattle, thinning just enough to let pale afternoon light spill across the wet streets. Celeste and Orion left the building together, walking at her own careful pace, no wheelchair, no walking frame. Just 2 people who had each carried loss quietly for years and had somehow, in the unlikeliest of circumstances, helped each other find their way back into the world. They were no longer simply a patient and the caregiver who had refused to give up on her. They were 2 people who had rediscovered, each in their own way, what it meant to believe in a future again. And as they walked down the front steps of the building into the softening afternoon light, neither of them looked back toward the doors they had just left behind.